Hi everyone, I'm going to show you how to stretch watercolour paper. It can be a cheaper option to actually stretching a canvas or buying a canvas, and I actually find it easier and very versatile. So what you need is some good quality watercolour paper. I'm using Arch's hot pressed sateen, which is really smooth. So it's good for painting on and glazing on. And you only need a lightweight, I'm using 180 GSM today. You'll need a staple gun, which you can buy from Bunnings quite cheaply, and some scissors. And I'm using store-bought stretcher bars. As you can see, I'm using 6" by 8". The first thing you need to do is soak your watercolour paper. So you can easily do that in your bathtub, or I don't have a bath, so I've just used my laundry trough. I soaked it for about 5 minutes in cold water, and now I'm just going to wipe off the excess water with some paper towel. So it's still quite damp and flexible. I'm going to put my stretcher bars on top. You'll see that I've cut my paper to be about 2 inches wider all around my stretcher bars. Now importantly, you've got to make sure you put the stretcher bars face down so that the flat side, which has numbers printed on it, is facing up. That means that the bevel side is facing down, and that's what we want. Now I'm going to make some diagonal cuts from each corner up to the edge of the stretcher bar, about 5mm up to the edge. That's important because when it comes to folding the paper around, it's a bit difficult to do the corners unless they're snipped. Okay, now it's quite similar to how we stretch canvas, in that we go on one side first, one staple, and then to the opposite. It's important to know that I'm not really pulling on the paper. I'm simply just placing it over like that, because when it dries, it tightens up all by itself. When you have those two sides stapled down, it's time to start the corners, which isn't the simplest part, but you do get the hang of it. I'm going to push in the side of this edge and create a pleat, and then staple that down. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side, push in at the side and make a pleat. And with this edge, I'm going to create the corner folds by folding that to the side on both edges and neatly placing it over the top so that I have a straight edge there on the side. So it looks like this close up. A nice neat fold on either side. Now you'll see that the paper is still quite loose. I'm not worried about that because I know that when it dries, it will be as tight as a drum. Now it's time for the stretched paper to dry. I'm going to use a cake cooling rack just because it lets air flow a little bit more. And it's important to lay the stretcher down face up and make sure it stays flat, because if you lean it against the wall, it doesn't dry evenly and it can sort of warp. So yes, it's important that you don't apply heat and you just let it dry naturally. It can take a few hours, but it's worth it. I'll show you a completed and dry stretcher. This is a painting by Sana Mestrom that I bought years ago. She stretched her own paper. She's made her own stretcher bar there. But as you can see, it's tight as a drum. The corners have sharpened up as they dried. A little bit hard to see that. But yeah, and I've had this painting for years. It's really durable and it lasts a long, long time. I'm going to make an oil painting on my stretcher and I'll show you that when it's dry. So now my paper is dry and nice and tight. So what I'm going to do is make an oil painting on it. Now, as you all know, you can't paint with oils on paper because it will rot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gesso this with some clear gesso. I'm using a Liquitex one, which is really good. I'm just going to lay that down really quickly. The nice thing about clear gesso is that you can let some of the raw paper show through if you don't want to paint over the whole surface. Now you might notice that while you're painting the first layer on, that the paper goes slightly slack again. But don't let that worry you, because when it dries it will bounce back to its taut former self. So you can see a little bit of buckling here going on in the corner. But yeah, that's not too bad. So I'm going to do a couple of coats of gesso, just so that it doesn't go through to the paper. Now, what I didn't mention before is why I'm stretching watercolour paper. Well, the reason is that watercolour paper is made of rag, it's not made of wood pulp. So it actually is an archival support to work on, just like canvas. The other thing I love about it is that if you stretch it, you can make a painting and it won't buckle. Because you've probably experienced on loose, thin watercolour paper like the one I'm using, if you wet it, it'll start to buckle and lose its nice flatness. So it's very hard to fix that if that happens. Another reason is because normally if you work on paper, you have to frame it. If you're working on a stretcher board, you can simply hang the painting up on the wall as it is, and it doesn't need framing. Because it's archival, it actually survives quite well without glass or a frame. So it's quite a nice little art object to make, and the smooth surface of the paper is even smoother than a canvas, which has a slight weave. So if you really love glazing and doing fine detail, it's actually really nice to work on. So I hope you have an experiment with it yourselves and enjoy working with watercolour paper. See ya.